The cowboy found her at dawn, standing beside a wagon that had already begun to roll away, its driver refusing to meet her eyes, and the sign nailed crookedly to the side still swinging with the words "Mail order, returned," as if she were a sack of grain deemed too heavy to carry. And when he reined in his horse she lifted her chin with a courage that looked practiced and tired at the same time, cheeks red from the cold and from something sharper than shame. And she told him without asking for pity that they sold her for being too big, that the neighbor who ordered her wanted a narrow waist and a quiet shadow and instead got a woman with broad shoulders, strong hands, and a laugh that filled rooms. And the cowboy, whose cabin sat alone where the pines met the creek, looked at her the way a man looks at a horizon he has never dared to cross and said, "You're just right for my arms," not as a promise but as a fact, and he lifted her down from the wagon as if she weighed no more than hope, the cold biting his fingers and the warmth of her settling into him like a story finally finding its place. And as they rode he learned her name in pieces because she spoke carefully, each word a stone laid across a river she had crossed too many times alone. And he told her about the cabin with the stove that smoked and the floor that creaked in the way the creek sang at night. And he told her he was not rich in money but rich in space and patience. And when they reached the cabin she stood in the doorway as if bracing for another judgment, but he stepped aside and made room. And the first night passed with the sound of wind and the quiet clink of tin cups and the knowledge that two strangers could share a roof without taking from each other. And the days that followed were a careful dance of work and watching, of chopping wood together and cooking meals that tasted better because they were shared. And she laughed once when he burned the bread and he laughed with her, surprised by how easily joy arrived when it was not weighed and measured. And he saw how the world had taught her to shrink and how she resisted by standing tall anyway. And he admired that resistance as much as her strength. And when the neighbor rode by and sneered and spoke of bargains and returns, the cowboy stood between them and said nothing more than, "She's home," and the word home settled into her bones like a promise kept. And that night by the fire she told him of letters written with hope and of a journey taken with faith and of the moment it all cracked. And he listened the way men rarely do, with his whole body leaning toward her. And he realized that love did not arrive as thunder but as shelter, as the steady choice to keep the door open and the fire lit. And though neither of them named it yet, something true had already taken root in the quiet of that cabin. Winter tested them the way truth always does, with storms that closed the passes and silence that pressed in. And in that testing the cowboy learned the measure of her not in inches but in endurance, in how she hauled water when the creek froze and how she mended torn coats with hands that had been called too much and found to be exactly enough. And she learned his in the way he rose before dawn without complaint and in the way he asked before touching her, even to hand her a mug, as if her consent were as natural as breathing. And one night when the wind howled like a warning from the past, she confessed the fear that had followed her from the wagon, the fear that he would wake one morning and see her as the world had taught him to see. And he answered by opening his arms and letting her decide the distance. And when she stepped into him he held her not to prove anything but to keep a promise he had already made. And the cabin seemed to grow warmer around them, and the seasons turned as seasons do, with spring breaking the ice and neighbors whispering and then quieting when they saw her walk beside him with her head high. And the old judgments lost their sharpness in the face of a life well lived. And he asked her to stay not as a rescue but as a partnership. And she agreed not out of fear but out of choice. And they planted a garden that thrived in stubborn soil. And laughter became a daily sound. And love unfolded in ordinary miracles. The sharing of burdens, the respect for strength, the tenderness that did not need to be small to be gentle. And when the neighbor came again, older and poorer in spirit, and spoke of mistakes, the cowboy did not boast and she did not gloat. They simply stood together, and that was answer enough. And in the evenings they sat on the porch watching the sky turn gold, and she realized that being too big had always been a lie told by people afraid of abundance. And he realized that true love was not found by ordering a dream but by opening your door to a person. And if this story moved you, if you believe that love is measured by courage and kindness rather than size or status, let it remind you to stand up for the overlooked, to choose generosity over judgment, and to support stories that celebrate dignity and heart. Like, share, and follow for more tales where compassion wins and ordinary people find extraordinary love. The truth about love revealed itself not in grand declarations but in the ordinary trials that followed, because once word spread that the cowboy had taken in the neighbor's abandoned mail-order bride, the world began to test whether kindness would bend or break, and visitors came under the bright daylight with smiles too sharp to trust. offering advice that sounded like concern and curiosity that felt like hunger. And she felt the old instinct rise in her chest, the urge to make herself smaller, to soften her voice and fold her shoulders inward so as not to offend. But each time she did, the cowboy noticed and gently corrected the lie without a single harsh word, placing his hand at the small of her back or meeting her eyes across the yard as if reminding her she did not need to disappear to be safe. And one afternoon, while they were repairing a fence beneath the open sky, a group of townsmen stopped to watch, their laughter floating in the air, and one of them joked that a man must be desperate to take what another had thrown away, and the woman froze, heart thudding with the familiar ache of rejection. But the cowboy straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said calmly that some men mistake abundance for excess and strength for inconvenience, and that he was not desperate but grateful, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any insult. And later, as the sun dipped low and the fence stood firm, she realized no one had ever defended her without expecting something in return, and that realization shook her more than cruelty ever had, because it asked her to trust rather than endure, and trust was a risk she had not practiced, and yet she found herself practicing it anyway as days turned into weeks, learning the rhythms of the land and of him, discovering that love could be spacious, that it could allow anger and laughter and silence to exist side by side, and when her past returned in the form of a letter stamped with regret and excuses, she did not hide it, and he did not demand explanations, but they read it together at the table in full daylight, and when she asked if he would ever wish she were different, smaller, quieter, easier, he answered by reminding her of every moment she had carried the weight when he was tired, every time her presence had made the cabin feel less lonely, and she began to understand that being chosen every day mattered more than being desired once. And as summer arrived and the land bloomed in stubborn color, they hosted neighbors who came not to judge but to learn, and children laughed freely around her without fear, and she saw herself reflected not as a burden but as a shelter. And one evening, standing beneath a wide sky painted with gold, the cowboy took her hands and said that love was not about fitting into someone else's dream but about building a life that could hold both of them fully. And she said yes, not because she needed saving but because she wanted belonging. And as they stood together in the open daylight, stronger for every trial endured, it became clear that the story was never about a woman who was too big, but about a world that was too small. And if this chapter stirred something in you, if you believe love should lift rather than limit, then let this story travel farther. Support it, share it, and stay with us for more stories where dignity triumphs, hearts heal, and true love is big enough to hold us all.